Howdy. Before I start, I was going to go into my background a little bit to kind of set the stage and to maybe highlight, I think, 3 important areas the federal government should be looking at. How many of y'all are federal employees in IT shops? Raise your hand. Okay, hands down. Vendors, or you provide some service into the government? Great, okay. The press, can I have all y'all come over here? No, I'm joking, I'm joking. Well, thanks for having me here. And look, I'm always nervous when folks kind of sometimes introduce me as an expert on cybersecurity. I'm always saying in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And in Washington, D.C., especially in Congress, we need more folks that understand these particular issues. Now, my degree is in computer science, so if some of y'all that are vendors need someone that can do some Fortran 77 code, let me know. I'm your guy. For those of y'all that did not understand that joke, maybe you're in the wrong conference. And I was walking across campus my freshman year in college at Texas A&M and saw a sign that said, take 2 journalism classes in Mexico City for $425. And when I had $450 in my bank account, so I went to Mexico. Fell in love being in another culture, seeing things I only read about in books, and added international studies as my minor. The first class I took in international studies, I had an old school Cold Warrior from the CIA as a guest lecturer, told the most amazing stories, and that began my interest in the CIA. And when I graduated at 22, I went into the agency. And I was a case officer, an operations officer. I was the dude in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting intelligence on threats to the homeland. I did 2 years in what I used to call the super secret CIA training facility called the Farm. And now it's on Google Maps. And I wish that was a joke. I did 2 years in India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City, a year and a half in Afghanistan where I managed our undercover operations, and it was one of the best jobs on the planet. But I also had to brief members of Congress, and I was pretty shocked by the caliber of our elected officials. And my mama said, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution, so I decided to run for Congress, and I lost. I lost an election by 700 votes, which is not a lot of votes, but it gave me the opportunity to become a partner in Crumpton Group, which is a small boutique strategic advisory firm where we would help clients go into markets they had never been in before. And many of our clients came up to us and said, hey, we have cybersecurity issues, can you help us? And we were all former CIA guys and gals, and being good former CIA guys and gals, we said we know a guy, and helped start Fusion X, which we did penetration testing, technical vulnerability assessment, things like that. And it was a great experience for me to understand the threats that are going on in the private sector, and it's experience that has been invaluable in my time here in Congress. And I chair a subcommittee on information technology, and one of the things that we are looking at is how do we defend our systems? Well, one of the problems we saw originally with defending our systems was that nobody was in charge. Across the federal government, we all had CIOs in every major agency. Oftentimes, the CIO did not have the authority to buy the widgets to defend that digital infrastructure. They did not have the power to decide what did or didn't go on to a network. So you can't hold somebody accountable if they don't have the responsibility and the authority to do their job. That's why Congress passed a law called FITARA, and we do a scorecard on it. And basically, a scorecard has become, basic digital hygiene within the federal government. And the goal is to make sure that the CIOs in every agency are the ones responsible for that network. And so that we can hold them ultimately accountable. We also realized that buying IT goods and services in the federal government was pretty silly. We all know, the district I represent in Texas goes from San Antonio to El Paso, 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It takes 10.5 hours to drive from one corner to the other. And it's San Antonio's big urban area, 7th largest city, and you have El Paso. And in the middle, there's more cows than people. But when you tell those folks, when you go and do events there and you say, in the federal government, if you don't use it, everybody knows that. That is an insane way to purchase things to defend our digital infrastructure. And that's why we introduced the Modernizing Government Technology Act. That says, if a federal CIO saves money by modernizing their digital infrastructure, let's say transitioning into the cloud, that savings they realize can get put into a working capital fund for that CIO to have access for 3 years. Real simple. This is pretty basic stuff. And again, don't live tweet this, but it's going to get put on the NDAA of the Senate this week, and this is going to ultimately come into law. And it's another tool for CIOs to use in order to modernize the system. What I have to educate my colleagues on is that the infrastructures within the federal government are so big that realizing savings and doing something like modernizing and being able to realize that savings in that same calendar year is next to impossible. So federal CIOs need to have the flexibility to purchase the IT goods and services they need in order to defend our digital infrastructure and in order to be more efficient. So that's one thing we've been working on. We've also learned that there really isn't a national cybersecurity strategy. What is a digital act of war? What's an appropriate response to it? I generally don't look to the UN for guidance, but if you look to the UN says if you manipulate, if you destroy someone's utility grid, that's an act of war. So when the Russians did that to the Ukrainians, tried to do it to the Estonians, what was the response? Nothing. Not every country has the right criminal laws to prosecute cyber criminals. So should our response to attacks from those countries be different than our responses in countries that have criminal laws? We should be having those kinds of conversations. Keith Alexander said this once in a hearing. He said, if the federal government thinks they can defend the digital infrastructure by themselves and the private sector can defend their infrastructure by themselves, that's the equivalent of the French thinking the Maginot Line is going to defend them from the Germans. We have to be working together, and the information sharing has to improve. But what information should we be sharing? I've asked every sophisticated user of intelligence when it comes to cybersecurity in the private sector, name me one great piece of information you got from the federal government. That's usually my response, by the way, right? That's a problem. And the problem is, and I know the Billington CyberSecurity Conference is known for talking about somewhat controversial topics. The private sector has a better idea of where the threat is coming from than the government does. That's why the financial services community, they know where the Russians are going to try to attack our financial industry. We need to turn those assumptions into collection requirements that then we can task the NSA and the CIA to go collect. The NSA and the CIA should be only going after the things only the government can do, and that's national state actors, that's APTs. Now, turning private sector assumptions into collection requirements is actually not very hard. Even tasking core collectors, people that used to do what I did, not too difficult. But once the federal government gets that information in their hands, trying to get it back into the private sector in order for them to help defend themselves is incredibly hard. And that's one of the problems that we have, and that's why I think Department of Homeland Security is so important. After the 9/11 Commission, it said one of the problems with information sharing across the federal government was the notion of need to know. And we had to transition to need to share. Now, information sharing on threats has improved significantly since 9/11 across the federal government. I call that horizontal sharing. We need to improve vertical sharing down to the private sector, local law enforcement. And DHS is the one entity that has the ability to go to and truly achieve need to share. And that's why we need to double down on DHS's role in coordinating information sharing between the public and private sector. When we talk about not having a national cybersecurity strategy, the Russians right now in Ukraine are utilizing and perfecting their latest tools when it comes to electronic warfare. Is anybody talking about that? People are still saying what's happening in eastern Ukraine is a separatist movement. There's 920 Russian tanks in eastern Ukraine. There are more Russian military officers in eastern Ukraine than Ukrainians. And they are using some of the latest electronic warfare that they are perfecting and going to ultimately use against their adversaries. Are we properly countering that activity in eastern Ukraine? It's a question for y'all. So, to be able to defend our digital systems, I think we have the talent. We have the CIOs that want to do it. We got to make sure they have the tools in order to do that. We got to have a broader strategy, and we got to fix IT procurement. And we also have to develop a cyber workforce for tomorrow. GAO, believes there's about 10 to 15,000 positions within the IT infrastructure across all 24 CFO agencies. Now, I don't have a list of, since there's no common job description for folks working in these areas, we don't know if of those 15,000 positions, we need 3,300 IT administrators. So this is the first step we got to fix. I also want to see the creation of a cyber National Guard. It starts with, if you're a kid and you want to go to college and do something on cybersecurity, we're going to try to find you some federal money, get you a scholarship. Let's say you get a 4-year scholarship, and then that means you're going to come work in the federal government for 4 years. Not at NSA, not at DOD, but at the US Census Bureau, at the Social Security Administration, at Department of Interior. These are places where we need people with talent. And then after you served your 4 years and you go get a job in the private sector, because let's be honest, we're never going to be able to compete on salaries with the private sector. But when you go work in the private sector, that company you go work for is going to loan you back for the proverbial 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. I think it's going to be more like 10 days a quarter, so that you can start building a rhythm, and you have people that have talent, and then you improve the cross-pollination of ideas between the public and private sector. These are some of the things that we need to do when it comes to developing tomorrow's cyber workforce. And I'll end with, we got to stay ahead of the curve on next generation technology. Everybody talks about machine learning and artificial intelligence, but are we adopting it into the government at a fast enough speed? Why are the analysts at the National Geospatial Agency still trying to determine if a vehicle moved 1/2 of a pixel on 2 camera shots? That's an easy thing to be using computer vision based on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And if we don't think this is important enough, Vladimir Putin said it best, and I'm sure everybody saw that last week, this week, I don't remember when it was, when he says whoever wins the arms race in artificial intelligence, they're going to win the day. And I agree with that. And are we doing enough to, one, protect what we're doing when it comes to artificial intelligence? Quantum computing. Quantum computing to me is still a philosophical issue. Right? How can a bit be a 1, a 0, both, or neither, all at the same time? But quantum computing is closer than we realize. And are we prepared to defend against quantum computing? Are we changing the debate on FBI v. Apple is going to look like a tickle fight when we start talking about quantum computing being a real thing? We got to be prepared, and we got to be on the cutting edge. That means basic research. That means introducing technology that's proverbial 2 guys and 2 gals in a garage that have some new thing. How do we get that into the federal government quicker in order to defend our infrastructure? And that's why IT procurement is so important. I'm going to stop there. I think we have some microphones for folks to ask a few questions, or I think I see a microphone over there. Maybe there's one in the back. Or if you just want to yell it out, I'll try to listen. And
we do have microphones here and also here. If you have questions by note card, please raise your hand, and we'll come by and pick them up.
Who's first?
Could you discuss a bit more about the Cyber National Guard? You've been a real champion of that.
Yeah, so once we were able to put MGT to bed, which inshallah is hopefully this week, we will focus on the legislation there. And I thought the most difficult piece was going to be finding funds for scholarships. That's actually that's been the quickest part to sort out. But it starts with, if you have a kid coming out of university, you want to be able to put them into a position right away. So that means you got to know what positions you need someone in to ensure that they have the right credentials in order to do that. And that's something that I was hoping by this time we would have a federal CIO where they can do a 30-day sprint and ensure we had the types of the types of job descriptions we need in order to marry up the academic experience and the proper credentials in order to do those jobs. But that is the hurdle we need to fix first in order to know where we need people. Because we can also, you don't have to go to school and then work in the government and be out in industry. We can start with the industry piece and get those folks already into the Cyber National Guard. And I think that's ultimately how we're going to populate this thing quickly. But we're starting to work on language and talking to folks. So whenever I speak in schools, I always tell the kids, I know what I know what I don't know, but what I don't know is the largest of those three categories. So if you all have some pearls of wisdom, please reach out to me and my staff.
Thank you very much, Congressman Hurd. We have one more question.
Thank you, Congressman. DHS announced just a couple hours ago that they issued a binding directive to ban Kaspersky Lab products from the federal government within 90 days. You, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I'm curious what you thought of the decision. Is it necessary, and are you concerned about any possible retaliation from Russia against U.S. companies in a similar fashion? Thank you.
I trust DHS to make these decisions, and is there going to potentially be retaliations? We'll see. I don't think getting into a tit for tat with Russia is in anybody's interest, but first and foremost, we needed to defend our own digital infrastructure. So I'm sure there will be many conversations about this, but again, I trust DHS, I trust the national security staff to make these decisions based on actual threats. We got to do this together. So I just want to thank the folks at Billington for bringing people together. I appreciate y'all coming to these kinds of events because we can be the cutting edge. The government has always been the cutting edge, and by working between the public and private sector together, we can make sure that we're defending the digital infrastructure of all of our fellow Americans. So thank y'all, God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.
Yeah, sure.